Hi, friends. This is Donniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi from the Shalom Hartman Institute. And this is, for heaven's sake, Israel at War, day 445. And today our topic is Hanukkah, this holiday of lights that is starting. And we're calling it Hanukkah Redefined, as we're going to explore together what Hanukkah means this year. How does this, on the one hand, very simple, beautiful holiday meet such a complicated period in our life? But Hanukkah is actually one of the most complicated of Jewish holidays. It was complicated because the rabbis didn't know what to do with it. They struggled with it. There's a very famous page in the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat, where the rabbis ask, what's Hanukkah? It's the only holiday of all of our holidays, and we have hundreds.
Growing all the time.
And like, they ask, what's Hanukkah? It's like strange. Like, you want to ask today, this is, ostensibly, it was 200-300 years after the Maccabees and the victory over the Assyrians. And they ask, what's the holiday? What's Hanukkah? And they weren't asking a historical question, what happened on Hanukkah. They were asking, what is the story we want to tell about Hanukkah? Because, as Clifford Geertz famously says, we're the sum of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's not just what happened to us, it's what we understand happened and what we talk about. Whether you're an individual, a family, a community, a nation, a religion, what are your stories? That's going to define who you are. They faced a challenge. There were this group of people who they weren't very comfortable with, the Maccabees, who were great heroes, possibly at one period of time, but within one generation themselves became Hellenizers and started to fight with rabbinic Judaism and took over the kingship and the priesthood and were generally a force for evil within our community. And they inherited them. And they said, what story should we tell? And on the one hand, there was the military victory. We did have a military victory for about 3 years or so, or 4 years. Again, over time, we don't have to say how long the victory was, as long as the victory lasted for a minute, which was itself a great moment in Jewish history. We didn't have that many moments. But they looked at it and they said, no, I don't want to tell that story. And in this page of Talmud, they changed it. And they basically, I know it might sound heretical, but they invented a miracle.
It might sound heretical.
Won't be the first time. But they basically did, because in the books of Maccabees, they talk about dedicating the temple and celebrating for 8 days the victory. But the rabbi said, no, the victory was a little, not a can of oil, what is it called?
I'll say a vessel of oil. A
vessel of oil. They didn't have cans back then. A clay, a pot, whatever, of something of oil. There was one. And they needed 8 and they only had 1, and then miraculously it lasted. And that was the holiday. The holiday was the holiday of light, which wasn't sufficient, which lasted for enough time until we could create or produce new oil, which would be pure for temple worship. And they shifted it completely from the victory of the Maccabees to a holiday of light, a holiday of, it's not just light, it's a holiday
purification of the temple.
The purification of the temple. And the purification of the temple was in the ancient stories, but now there was this new miracle. Mm-hmm. And they said, my Hanukkah, what is Hanukkah? This is Hanukkah. Now, while the rabbis were struggling with it, Zionists didn't struggle with it.
With the military side of Hanukkah.
Not only did they not struggle with the military, they didn't struggle with Hanukkah at all, period.
Right.
They loved it. It was, when they had looked back in their history, these were the heroes. They saw themselves, Zionists see themselves as a continuation of the Maccabees. This is in many ways the first Zionist act. It led to independence. It was Jews taking responsibility for themselves. They leave aside the whole Hellenization story, the inner dimension of the Maccabees fighting against internal assimilationist forces. We fought both the Assyrians and their supporters of the Jewish community. It was the military victory. This is the contrast. And the rabbis wanted to move us, and it's interesting. The major ritual of the holiday is the holiday of light, and Zionists loved the candles, etc. But it was all about the military victory. And this struggle, which was a rabbinic struggle, a Zionist struggle, how do you understand this simple beautiful, donuts, candles. Like, what could be wrong? It's like we even added presents every night. We're 8 times more powerful than Christmas. It's like there's no end to the new bounty of the Jewish people and this complicated story that our tradition is struggling with.
Listening to you, Donniel, compare the rabbinic approach to Hanukkah to fast forward 1,800 years later, the Zionist approach to Hanukkah, it's so moving because what you see there in this dichotomy are the 2 projects that were necessary to preserve the Jewish people. The project of the rabbis who had just experienced the loss of Jewish sovereignty and power was to prepare the Jewish people for prolonged powerlessness. The project of the Zionists was to take the Jews out of the condition of powerlessness and prepare them to re-inhabit the condition of power. And Hanukkah becomes the template in which this extraordinary drama takes place, the drama of into exile and the drama out of exile. It's beautiful. When you think about Hanukkah in that way, it adds such a richness to the story.
Like I said, we are the sum of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. The way you just told the story is beautiful. It's like where the story is this inner struggle. Which one do we need at which time?
Exactly. And these were both necessary approaches.
The early Zionists there was a remarkable poem that my colleague Tomer Persico shared with me, in which early Zionists speak about themselves. We are the carrier of the torches. And in that poem, they said, no miracle happened to us. We didn't find a vessel of oil. We mined or broke the rocks with our blood, and then there was light.
We are the light.
We are. Right. If there is light, we are the light.
Now, there's something so, in one way, so arrogant about this. And yet, think about the condition of the Jewish people when the Zionists are writing these poems. We're on the verge of annihilation, and they're trying to salvage the Jewish people.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
He's telling them, don't count on this miracle.
Yeah.
And even more, in our prayer services, we add a special prayer during Purim and Hanukkah. It's called Al Nisim, on the miracles. There, they recognize the military victory. But it's the military victory that God
brings.
Ashasita Rabotenu, that you, God, did to our forefathers and foremothers. Yeah. It's not even the Maccabean. It's like they're almost mentioned by chance. You happen to be there, but in essence, Hanukkah is made it's just like Pesach. Now, it's just like in Israel, you can't grow from Pesach because it's like sort of God's business. It's like, you did the stuff. Yeah, how many plagues were there? There were 10. No, there wasn't 10. There were 50. How many 50? There were 250. It's like, okay, it's a straight, but like Hanukkah was us, and Purim, we didn't really win. It was like sort of a strange little thing of what we did there, but we won, but it wasn't exactly great heroism. But Hanukkah, we had real heroes.
Yeah.
And by the way, every hero is a complicated hero. They're all complicated. Whenever you're wielding power and you're fighting it, it's always going to be complicated.
But let's go back for a moment to the rabbis, because there's a drama that's playing out there that's really profound. The rabbis had not only just experienced the loss of sovereignty, but the loss of sovereignty due to zealotry, to Jewish fanaticism, the doomed revolt against Rome, which had no chance of succeeding, which the rabbis warned against. And so part of this project of the rabbis is not only to prepare the Jews for powerlessness, but to look at the consequences of the arrogance of power. And this isn't only a philosophical exercise. The rabbis deeply believed that one day the Jewish people would return home, which means one day we would re-inhabit power.
Or God would then.
Or God, okay.
You pass the buck in that sense.
Yes, right.
I don't know if they ever imagined
that we would re-inhabit power. It's an interesting question.
I wonder, whether it's you look. It's who knows. I really don't know. But there's so much about God. They were such people of faith, and we were going to return only with the return of the Messiah. And with the Messiah, you're talking about God returning and taking care of stuff.
But we would be a powerful people.
Oh, that we would be. We would wield power. But
and I
as
wonder
the extension
if
of God's hand.
when I read it, and obviously I'm reading into them retroactively, but I sense that they're speaking to us, that they were in some way not only speaking to their time,
Yes.
but anticipating the moment when the Jews would be powerful again. And these are the lessons we learned from the failure of power the first time around. Yeah. And the Zionists come along and, at least initially, completely discard the rabbi's caution and embrace power as an unequivocal good, as a life force.
As they should. Don't forget, we're coming on to 78 years.
This is the 1930s and the 1940s.
I understand that.
Yeah. And so there's something else, though, that if you look at the evolution of the Israeli attitude toward Hanukkah, and you'll really see in that, again, in that story, the template for our evolving attitudes toward power. And you and I have spoken about this in the past, how the turning point was the Yom Kippur War, 1973. And here you can really contrast 1967, which is the peak of the arrogance of power and the celebration of what we did. And I visited Israel for the first time as a boy in the summer of 67. Everywhere you looked, there were banners, Kol HaKavod LiTzahal, all honor to the IDF. By 1973, that slogan was gone. And there was a humbling in the shock of the near defeat of 1973. And I'm wondering, and again, I'm speculating here, but I sense a softening in the militaristic aspect of Hanukkah in Israel from that time, because it really did change.
It did change. But we're 445 days in the war, 445 days in which all the power that we have hasn't brought our hostages home. But at the same time, and I've learned this from you, do you remember, it must have been, can't even remember what it was, a few months ago, when we started the war in Lebanon and we attacked Hezbollah with the beepers? I was very upset. I was upset that it was going to be a bridge too far.
And also, it didn't seem to you that there was a context.
There was a context.
No plan.
I didn't know. And then I was proven wrong. One of the things that we learned is that, thank God we have power. On the one hand, power is simpler now. This 445 days, it's been such a roller coaster, and our feelings change so often. It's almost daily. But part of the story, there's the frustration of the pain and of the limitations of our power. There's the questions of our abuse of the power and how you're supposed to use it correctly. But at the same time, 445 days later, Israel today feels safer than it's felt since October 7th. And then we discovered that October 6th, our sense of safety was false. We had allowed things to grow on our borders and threats to materialize that, and we just chose to ignore them. On the one hand, as we're coming to Hanukkah, we could celebrate them back. There's a simplicity to it. I don't think, if it wasn't for our conversations together, if I would be saying this. It's not a natural part of my sentiment. But if you look at it, with all the horror and all the questions, thank God we had that power. Yeah. Look what we changed now in the north. Look what we were able to do now in Syria. Again, we don't know. And again, the Houthis are still firing. And I'm the last one to idealize the power and to think that I've been talking continuously that because you have power, it doesn't mean that that's the solution. But at the same time, because power is not the solution to every problem, it is a solution to some problems.
Right.
And it really is. And celebrating Hanukkah as a military...
It is a solution, for example, to malevolent genocidal power.
It's not always. It's like we hope that it will be. And in our case, there has been great, great consequences, positive ones, to the power that we have. The question is, how do we re-engage the two sides of the story? Just embracing back to the early Zionists, yes.
Now, you mentioned October 7th a moment ago, and I think it's important to examine what happened to us on October 7th in the context of the Zionist project to create heroic archetypes. The shock of October 7th, I don't think this is sufficiently appreciated abroad, wasn't just the atrocities. It wasn't just the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust. It was the fact...
It's like a slogan.
Yeah, exactly. It was the fact that 1,000 Jews or more died in the state of Israel in a condition of helplessness.
Yeah.
And this is the shock. The army was nowhere to be seen. It's the trauma of helplessness, which is the complete negation of Hanukkah, of the Zionist that Israelis grew up on. And so the project of this last year, in a sense, was to restore the credibility of the Zionist idea of Hanukkah, that we will actually be able to protect ourselves again.
But it's interesting. I agree with you. And I think we've reestablished it. You used the word deterrence.
We have reestablished.
Or even if it's not whether it's deterrence, or it's just power.
And that's something to actually celebrate this
Listen,
Hanukkah.
Israel is safer today than it was on October 6th.
That's right. Very much.
That's a big deal.
That's actually an extraordinary statement. And, we kind of sense it, but to say it out loud, say, whoa, what are you? And you spoke about a roller coaster. What a roller coaster.
And it's interesting, when you look at Israelis. Do you remember last Hanukkah?
Neil, I don't remember yesterday. And really, it's still a time of timelessness. I still feel that way.
There are advantages to being ADHD. One thing I don't remember, but thousands of details, somehow each one fits somewhere.
I also have learning disabilities, but when you factor in the strangeness of the last 14 months.
But I remember
Hanukkah.
I remember the Hanukkah celebration in the Institute last year. It was solemn, tearful. And throughout the country, Hanukkah was about, could we find any light in the midst of this darkness? It was interesting. For Zionists, for Israel, it was all about the light. It was about light. I felt like I was...
Not about the sword.
Not about the sword, not about the Maccabees.
Right.
It wasn't the Maccabees. It was
bringing the rabbis back.
It was bringing the rabbis back. And it was, maybe at that time, it was a Hanukkah outside of Israel. It wasn't the Israeli Hanukkah of the Maccabees and the kids dressing up as soldiers and swords and the sword fights. And it was none of that. It was solemn. And we said, is there any light in our life? And we looked, and I remember each light, each candle was... One was to remember the hostages. One was for the soldiers who fell. One was for the policemen who and the heroism that they showed in Shderot and in Ofakim. One was for the soldiers who came to the kibbutzim. One was for the emergency aid people. One was for the volunteers of civil society. It was just. It's like you're grasping.
And these are also the people who are bringing light. So there is a Zionist element in that. It's like we're the ones who are bringing the light.
It was. It's beautiful. But we were like, is there any light in our life? It was a prayer. Hanukkah was a prayer that light will return. And with each candle we were saying, we're not going to be in this darkness forever. We had a podcast a few weeks ago about the crossroads. I feel like Hanukkah this year is at a crossroads too. There isn't much conversation about the military heroism. Like if you look in the street, it's almost like there's no preparation for Hanukkah this year. It's true, fried donuts, are out. But it's not, Hanukkah is always this month-long holiday in Israel. It's a month-long celebration from when the donuts start being sold by Roladin, this bakery, and they change the story. There's a subdued nature to it. And I think, as I was just right before coming to the studio, I just walked by and I said, how are you feeling? This woman said to me, this is the second Hanukkah that the hostages aren't home. That's all she says. How could I be?
That's how she's counting Hanukkah now.
That's how she's counting Hanukkah.
Right.
Like a second Hanukkah?
Yeah.
So we had Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur are the days for reflection and responsibility. Sukkot comes, that's the anniversary. Now this is the second Hanukkah. There shouldn't have been a second Hanukkah. And she says, what am I supposed to sell?
And so it's Hanukkah as a struggle between darkness and light, which of course, coming around the solstice is it's reflected in the environment. And when I was
for the record, I have no idea what you just said.
the winter solstice. It's the darkest. The darkest.
Okay.
The least light during the year.
Okay.
And so for Hanukkah to come at that time is also
there was a countercultural move.
There was something there.
Something going on, being played out.
But when I was on my way to the studio this morning, I passed a new banner for the hostages. For our listeners who haven't been to Israel since October 7th, literally every corner, everywhere, in every city and town, there are banners for the hostages. And these banners are constantly being updated with new messages. So the latest message, obviously intended for Hanukkah, is bring them out of the darkness.
Yeah.
We are so much in this consciousness of Hanukkah. It's not a total throwback to the rabbi's move of taking us away from power, but it's a kind of a mediation. It's a softening of the old Zionist unequivocal embrace of power.
Thank God we have the power,
right?
But now we're almost taking it for granted. Now this Hanukkah, we know that we've achieved whatever power is going to achieve.
And so let's have a ceasefire and save the hostages.
Because the power is not going to bring them home.
Light. That's right.
That's the light.
That's right. That's very interesting.
We're looking for that.
Yeah. Beautiful.
We're grasping. And
one of the things I love about the Jewish holidays generally is that they're so dynamic. They're so elastic. They're constantly, every generation constantly reinterprets. Each different denomination, each different ideology within Judaism appropriates the holiday for their own purposes. And it's extraordinary to see that. And if you think about, just to segue for a moment to the diaspora, how the diaspora has played out Hanukkah. And you see this especially in North America, or I can say North America because that's a diaspora that you and I know. But there the move was to further soften Hanukkah and to make Hanukkah almost an interfaith friendly holiday. It's the festival of religious pluralism, of religious freedom. Now, of course, historically, Hanukkah was quite the opposite. Hanukkah was the reassertion of Judaism against, in quotes, pluralistic paganism.
The Zealots were the Maccabees.
They
weren't just warriors. They were religious fanatic zealots.
Yes, but they
that's not the story we choose to tell.
That's not the story, right.
And therefore it doesn't matter, yes.
And so, but if you look at the ways in which Israelis and American Jews have told the story of Hanukkah, each community was telling the story of Hanukkah that it needed, that was appropriate to its own circumstances. We were surrounded by enemies. We are still. And we needed a Hanukkah of muscles. We needed a Hanukkah that reassured the Jews that we'd be able to protect ourselves. American Jews and Canadian Jews and in England and elsewhere were embraced by their society. And they needed a Hanukkah that would embrace their societies in return. We needed a Hanukkah of deterrence against our hostile surroundings. They needed a Hanukkah of embrace to their benevolent surroundings. And this is how it's played out. But I wonder, Donniel, whether this year in the diaspora, just as our Hanukkah is changing here in Israel, I wonder if their Hanukkah is a little less interfaithy, pluralistic, and a little more inward, a little more, we need some of that Hanukkah backbone, some of that not militarism, but, some of that strength.
It's a different Hanukkah. It's true. I just came back from 3 weeks of travel. My whole history as an anti-Semitism poo-pooer, and I don't
anti-Semitism.
I'm an anti-Semitism person, and the thing that I met people, person after person, and I spoke about this. That this is not 1935 when people. I never spoke about it, but in every event there was always a question about anti-Semitism. But it's palpable.
Yeah,
it's real. People don't feel the same. Part of my Torah was that we have to develop a way to respond to the particular fears that we have, not to either exaggerate them or to expand them to everybody, but we need a nuance and a sophistication because it's real. From the left and the right, there is a fear, there's an instability, a sense of lack of security, and you can say to somebody, get over it. That's not true. It's real. Wherever I went, people aren't feeling as safe. So you're right. Hanukkah is not this, the feeling that this is the most welcoming part of it. It's still the most welcoming diaspora in Jewish history, but it doesn't feel as welcoming for many people, and the concern is real. And so Hanukkah is going to change. It can't. I'm not saying that they're going to For North American Jews, the Maccabee story is not, the Jew of power. Who you, the diaspora experience is not an experience of integration through hard power, through military force.
Right.
It isn't. Hanukkah, in many ways, the holiday of light, we Jews are the best. Part of one of the unique features of Jews is we were minorities, and even when we were attacked, or even when we suffered, or even when our host country wasn't in love with us, we were always the best citizens. The Jew was the best. Like, at least let's talk about in the 20th century, 19th, right. 20th centuries. We were the best. We were the best citizens. We were.
You almost said the best Germans.
It's true.
And we were the best.
And we
Germans.
were the best Germans. We were the best. And Jewish holidays are moments of particularity. When we didn't have our own space, we had our own time. We sanctified time. That's old Torah. And we had Jewish time. And Jewish time was a time, just like Shabbat, where you enter into the context of your particular Jewish identity, think about your values, reinforce them, and then you go back into the world. Both food and time created a consistent Jewish identity for 2,000 years. But Hanukkah, the way it was embraced in North America in particular, is this was not the moment where we Jews needed to reinforce our own, even though it had that dimension versus Christmas. You have your Christmas, we have our Hanukkah. So there was like this inner competition. Yes, don't worry, and we could. And you have all these comedians, comparing, how pathetic Hanukkah is versus Christmas. Like don't make it our own time. But in the larger meta story of American Jewry, not what you celebrated in your family and Canadian Jewry, it is we are the people of light. We spread light. We do. We're good people. We're bringing light, whether it's religious pluralism, whether it's decency. So that story is still going to be there, but it's with a heavier heart. It's not as embracing, but that overall motif, that need for light. And I feel that it's interesting that both communities maybe now this year are searching for that light.
And maybe each community is learning something from the other's Hanukkah. Where we have a bit of a softer Hanukkah, and diaspora Jews may have a bit of a harder Hanukkah, a more assertive Hanukkah.
It's going to be more of a prayer than a celebration.
Right.
We need some light. And I think one of the important questions that Israeli society is going to have to ask itself, vis-a-vis the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and I think also world Jewry. What's the story we tell? As our circumstances change, our stories have to change. And what's the story we're going to tell of power and light? Until the hostages come home, there's no light. You feel it. There is no light in Israel. It's like it's spreading. There's this heaviness. It's even, some people are even lashing out like, let us win. If it wasn't for you, we could have won. That's some of that dynamic. But it is that heaviness. What are we going to celebrate? What are the stories we're going to tell? And how do we balance light and power? And this old, what's Hanukkah, is a 2,000-year-old question. Like so often, it might be one of the more relevant questions for Zionism today. Last words, Yossi?
This feels to me, as a result of this conversation, that this is in some ways the most mature Hanukkah that we've experienced as Israelis. Because on the one hand, we're coming after an historic victory. We have once again validated the Zionist return to power. We can protect ourselves. We can come back from the abyss. And on the other hand, the ongoing agony of the hostages and of the whole society is held hostage, is that it's not enough.
It's just not enough.
And so this is a moment where we own the power. We're grateful for the power, as you said earlier. And yet we also know that power in the end is never enough.
Yeah, it's like, people say to me, I never relate to this when people say, if the hostages don't come home, Israel has no right to be internally. It's too
it's more of an emotional statement.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't like it. But in this sense, there is no light. It's like our power. Who are we? We're looking. And let's end with really a very deep prayer. It's 445 days in which our hostages are in very dark tunnels and in a horrific reality. In Israel, you feel more and more people, the consensus is growing. stronger and stronger and stronger as the second Hanukkah passes, that we have to bring them home. It seems that it's positive, but, as we take a step forward, there's a step back, and we don't know. It's in Hamas's hands. It's in our government's hands. What do we do? Just let them come home and let there be greater Hanukkah light. Let a more long-lasting light return into our lives. Yossi, a pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful.
Chag Sameach to everybody. Happy holidays.
This episode was sponsored by Lois Kahn-Clar and Gary Clar. You too can sponsor an episode of For Heaven's Sake. The link to donate can be found in the show notes or at shalomhartman.org/For Heaven's Sake. We will acknowledge your gift on a future episode. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or visit shalomhartman.org/Israel at War.